Apostle Island Shore, Wisconsin, October 1878. The autumn air, sharp with the promise of ice, carried the rhythmic thud of a maul against wood and the grunts of a solitary man. Along the shingle beach, where summer's fishing boats were now pulled high and covered, the settlers of the new shore camp paused their work. They watched Sigurd Vetlesen. They had been watching him for weeks. He was not building a cabin. He was committing an act of profound foolishness. The log walls stood no more than 5 feet high, a stout but ridiculously low foundation. Perched beside it like a beached whale lay the reason for the mockery. It was the entire port side section of the Good Fortune, a 2-masted schooner that had met its end on the rocks of Sand Island the previous November. Vetlesen had spent a month salvaging it, a massive curving structure of 3-inch oak planks, its great ribs pointing to the sky like the bones of a dead leviathan. Now, with a system of levers and rollers that only he seemed to understand, he was inching it toward the low walls. He meant to put it on top, as a roof. Pernell Quackenbush, the local agent for the Bayfield Lumber Company, stood with his arms crossed, a look of professional pity on his face. He was a man who understood wood. He understood board feet, saw logs, ridge poles, and the brutal physics of a Wisconsin winter. "That man is building his own tomb," he said to Jedediah Stone, a trapper whose face was a roadmap of past winters. "It's a boat, Pernell," Stone grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "A boat belongs on the water, not in the air." Quackenbush shook his head, stepping closer as Sigurd paused to wipe sweat from his brow. "It's not the idea of it, Jed. It's the material. That's green hull oak, caulked with ship's pitch for a life in the water. It needs to stay wet. Once that November wind hits it, that oak is going to swell, the planks will cup, and every seam will pop. He'll be living under a sieve by January." He raised his voice. "Vetlesen, that pitch will let go by March. You'll have daylight showing through every plank." Sigurd Vetlesen looked at the lumber agent. He was not a large man, but his shoulders and forearms were dense with the corded muscle of a lifetime shaping heavy timbers. He nodded once. "The pitch will hold," he said, his Norwegian accent sanding the edges off the words. Then he turned back to his lever, and the great hull scraped another inch forward. The men watching shook their heads. The man was not just foolish, he was mad. He was building a house that was upside down, inside out, and bound to fail. What did this Norwegian boat builder, this botbigger, understand about a curved shell envelope and the behavior of dense oak that these master lumbermen and experienced frontier cabin builders had missed? The answer to that question would rewrite the rules of survival on this unforgiving shore. It would be paid for with mockery in the autumn, proven in the heart of a brutal winter, and finally understood in the quiet glow of a candle flame that refused to flicker. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn not just the story of a strange roof, but the fundamental physics of why it worked. Principles that architects and engineers still use today. Subscribe to this channel and let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional solution to a problem you've ever seen work? Sigurd Vetlesen was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, a logger, or a frontiersman. He was a botbigger, a man who had spent 30 years in a fjordside workshop near Bergen, a place that smelled perpetually of oak shavings, hot pitch, and the cold salt sea. His hands knew the language of the adze, the draw knife, and the caulking iron. His mind worked in curves, not angles. He understood how to shape heavy oak strakes, steaming them until they bent to his will, fastening them into a clinker-built hull that could shed the waves of the North Atlantic. He knew that a well-built hull was more than a vessel. It was a self-contained world, a sealed environment designed to protect the men within from the killing cold of the water just inches away. He had brought his wife, Solveig, and their two children, Lars and Astrid, to America for the promise of land and a life built by their own hands. They arrived in the Apostle Islands with little more than his tools and a quiet determination. Their first winter, in 1877, had been in a standard-issue settler's cabin, a single-room green timber box with a flat plank and sod roof, built in a hurry against the coming cold. That winter had nearly broken them. It was a lesson in failure, taught one miserable day at a time. Sigurd, who had spent his life building structures to keep men warm and dry at sea, found he could do neither on land. The cold was not a visitor. It was an occupant. It lived in the corners of the room. It settled on the floor in a layer so dense that 7-year-old Lars and 5-year-old Astrid never took their boots off. Solveig's morning ritual was not stoking a warm fire, but chipping a breathing hole in the ice that sealed the water bucket overnight. When Sigurd tried to write a letter back to Norway, the ink crusted into a black sludge in its bottle halfway through a sentence. In the mornings, the wicks in the oil lamps were frozen stiff, brittle as twigs. Their most vivid memory of that winter, the image that haunted them, was of a fork left in the butter crock on the table. By morning, the butter was frozen so solid that the fork stood perfectly upright, a tiny silver monument to their misery. They burned through their entire woodpile by February and spent the rest of the winter huddled together under every blanket they owned, the fire a desperate, hungry thing that consumed wood but gave back little comfort. Sigurd knew he had failed his family. He would not fail them again. The problem, as Sigurd came to understand it, was not simply the cold. The problem was the box. The conventional cabins that dotted the shoreline, built with the hard-won wisdom of the American frontier, were all variations on the same flawed design. Pernell Quackenbush's own shanty, considered a model of tight construction, was a perfect example of this failure. It was built of squared-off pine logs, meticulously chinked with moss and clay. It had a proper plank floor and a sturdy ridgepole supporting a pitched roof of hand-split shakes. By the standards of the settlement, it was a fine home. Yet, it bled heat like a sieve. The core failure was one of geometry and air. The flat ceiling created a thermal trap. All the heat from Quackenbush's cast-iron stove rushed upward, pooling in a useless layer just beneath the roof boards. A man standing on a chair to reach something from a high shelf would feel sweat on his brow, while his feet, 5 feet below, remained numb with cold. This stratification was not just inefficient, it was dangerous. It meant burning 3 times the wood for half the comfort. Worse still was the infiltration. A log cabin is a collection of seams, hundreds of feet of chinking between logs, gaps around the door and window frames, and most critically, the long, vulnerable joint of the ridgepole. Every one of these seams was a path for the cold. On a windy night, and every winter night on Lake Superior was windy, the cabin didn't just lose heat, it was actively scoured of it. The wind forced cold air in through cracks on the windward side, and the pressure difference sucked warm air out through gaps on the leeward side. This constant, invisible river of air, a process called convection, was the true enemy. You could feel it in the way a candle flame would gutter and dance, even in a seemingly sealed room. You could see it in the fine powder of snow that would appear along the base of a wall after a storm, having been driven straight through the chinking. The frost on the nail heads inside the walls was a clear sign. The iron, a good conductor, was pulling the killing cold from the outside straight into the living space. The settlers fought back by stuffing rags into cracks and piling snow against the foundations. But these were acts of desperation, not engineering. The design itself was wrong. Sigurd watched all of this during that first winter. He saw the frost spines that appeared on every roof in the settlement, A ghostly white line along the ridgepole where escaping interior warmth melted the snow just enough for it to refreeze as a crest of ice. It was a signpost of failure, visible to anyone who knew how to look. The cabins were fighting the winter and losing. Sigurd knew he couldn't win by fighting harder with the same failed design. He had to build something that didn't fight the cold at all, but simply refused to acknowledge it. He needed to build a boat. The work of building began in the late summer sun. Sigurd didn't fell a single tree for his roof. His timber was already harvested, shaped, and seasoned by the waters of Lake Superior. He and his son, Lars, spent weeks with block and tackle, slowly hauling the massive section of hull up from the shoreline. It was back-breaking labor. The oak was waterlogged and impossibly heavy. The settlers watched with amusement. When he finally had it near his chosen site, he began building the walls. They were low, barely chest-high, made from stout cedar logs he'd squared with a broadaxe. Solveig brought them water and bread, her face a mask of quiet composure. "They think you are building a troll's house, Sigurd," she said one afternoon, her voice soft. "Let them," he replied, not looking up from his work. "Trolls are warm in winter." The day he raised the roof was a spectacle. Using a gin pole and a complex arrangement of ropes and levers, he and Lars slowly, painstakingly, lifted the curved hull. It pivoted into the air, a dark crescent against the autumn sky, and then settled onto the log walls with a deep groan that echoed across the water. The fit was perfect. The hull's outer edge, the gunwale, rested flush on the top log. The curved ribs of the wreck now served as internal rafters, describing a perfect, unbroken arch overhead. There was no ridgepole. There was no flat ceiling. The inside of his home was now the shape of the inside of a boat. For the next month, he worked on sealing it. This was the part he knew best. He used his caulking irons to pack new oakum, tarred hemp fibers, into every seam between the thick planks. He rendered pine pitch in a great iron kettle over an open fire, the sharp, medicinal smell drifting through the settlement. Then, he paid the seams with hot pitch, a thick, black, waterproof seal. It was the same process he would have used to make a hull watertight. Now, he was making it airtight. Pernell Quackenbush made another visit during this phase. He ran a skeptical hand over the freshly pitched seams. "I grant you it's tight for now, Vetlesen," he conceded. "But this is land. There's no give. That oak is going to move. It will swell with the damp, then shrink in the dry stove heat. It will fight itself. Those planks will cup and twist. Your seams won't hold." Sigurd was fitting a small, square window into the south-facing wall. He finished tapping a wooden peg into place before turning to the lumber agent. He looked Quackenbush in the eye. "A ship on the sea is always fighting," he said calmly. "It twists, it hogs, it sags. The planks are always moving, but the hull remains one piece. This is why we build with oak." He gestured at the curving interior. "This roof has already been in a storm greater than any winter." He then returned to his work, leaving Quackenbush to stare at the bizarre, beautiful, and, in his expert opinion, doomed structure. To understand why Sigurd Vetlesen was right and Pernell Quackenbush was wrong, you have to unlearn everything you know about a conventional roof. You have to stop thinking about a house as a box and start thinking of it as a shell. The genius of the Vetlesen roof was its curved shell envelope, a principle of both structural and thermal dynamics that the Norwegian boat builder understood in his bones. First, consider the structure. A conventional roof with a ridgepole is under constant stress. Gravity pulls the two sloping sides downward and outward, trying to flatten the triangle and push the walls apart. The ridgepole is a point of critical weakness. On the Vetlesen roof, there was no ridgepole. The curved hull acted as a monolithic arch. The forces of gravity were distributed evenly down the curve of the hull and into the low, sturdy log walls. Like an eggshell, the shape itself provided immense strength. Where a standard roof might sag under a heavy snow load, the hull would only grow stronger, the compressive forces tightening the structure. But the real magic was thermal. Inside a standard cabin, the heat from a stove rises and spreads out across the flat ceiling. The hottest air forms a layer at the top, while the coldest, densest air sinks to the floor. The result is a massive temperature difference, perhaps 80 degrees at the ceiling and 35 degrees at the floor. To warm your feet, you have to overheat the entire upper volume of the room, burning immense amounts of fuel. In Sigurd's cabin, there was no flat ceiling to trap the heat. The hot air from his small stove rose, met the curved, smooth interior of the hull, and immediately began to circulate. The curve guided the air, creating a gentle, continuous convection loop. The warm air moved up and along the arch, slowly cooling as it went, and sinking back down the other side to be reheated by the stove. This constant, slow-moving current of air eliminated thermal stratification. The temperature difference between the floor and the peak of the arch was less than 10 degrees. The entire living space, from head to foot, was bathed in an even, consistent warmth. Then there was the problem of infiltration. Sigurd's boat-building techniques created a nearly perfect air barrier. The thick oak planks, swollen tight and sealed with oakum and pitch, were impermeable to the wind. A standard log cabin might have an air exchange rate of several complete volumes per hour, meaning the stove was constantly trying to heat a fresh supply of frigid outside air. Sigurd's cabin had an air exchange rate close to zero. He was only heating the air that was already inside. Finally, there was the oak itself. The 3-inch thick hull was not an insulator in the modern sense, but it possessed tremendous thermal mass. Throughout the day, the dense wood absorbed the heat from the stove, storing thousands of BTUs within its fibers. When the fire was banked for the night, the wood slowly began to re-radiate that stored heat back into the living space. The walls themselves became a giant, gentle radiator, maintaining a stable temperature for hours after the fire died down. The settlers in their drafty cabins woke to a freezing room. The Vetlesens woke to a gentle, residual warmth. Sigurd hadn't just built a roof, he had built a thermal flywheel. That December, the winter came not as a creeping cold, but as an assault. A vast dome of Arctic high pressure settled over Lake Superior, pushing temperatures down to 30 degrees below zero and holding them there. For 10 days, the sun was a pale, useless wafer in a steel-gray sky. There was no snow, which was worse, no soft white blanket to insulate the cabins. Instead, a dry, relentless offshore wind scoured the landscape, seeming to pull the very heat from the timbers of the houses. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a state of siege. Life shrank to the few feet around the stove. Every piece of wood fed into the fire seemed to vanish without a trace, its heat snatched away by the drafts. The chinking between the logs, shrunk by the dry cold, opened up into tiny cracks that whistled with the wind. Families slept in their coats, huddled together. The sound of axes ringing in the frozen woods was constant, as men were forced to cut more and more firewood just to survive the night. Silas Crane, the cooper, found his barrel staves shrinking so much in the dry air that the iron hoops fell off. Jedediah Stone returned from his trap line to find 2 of his sled dogs had frozen in their sleep. It was a time of misery and fear. Inside the Vetlesen cabin, life went on. The small, efficient stove glowed with a steady, moderate fire. Sigurd burned less than a third of the wood his neighbors did. The air inside was still and quiet. There were no drafts. The only sound was the low moan of the wind passing over the curved hull high above, a distant and irrelevant noise, like the sea. The interior of the oak planks was cool to the touch but never cold, and certainly never frosted. The thermal mass of the wood held the day's heat, creating a bubble of stability in the midst of the Arctic chaos. Here, the domestic warmth of the cabin became the ultimate proof. Solveig sat near the window in the afternoons, mending fishing nets with her bare hands, the light from the low sun pooling on her work. The air smelled of drying wool, coffee, and the faint, pleasant scent of the warm oak. Lars and Astrid, free from the tyranny of the cold floor, lay on a bearskin rug, drawing pictures on a slate. One evening, as the temperature outside plunged to its lowest point, Solveig baked bread. The warm, yeasty smell filled the single, comfortable room, a simple act of domesticity that was, in this brutal cold, an impossible luxury. They were not surviving. They were living. On the 9th day of the Arctic outbreak, Pernell Quackenbush saddled his horse. His job as a lumber agent included damage assessment, and he needed to tally the toll this cold snap was taking on the settlement structures. He rode along the shoreline, his breath freezing instantly on his scarf. The scene was one of uniform failure. On nearly every cabin, the extreme cold had caused the green timbers of the ridgepoles to shrink and sag. Some had dropped by as much as 6 inches, a catastrophic failure that would require a complete rebuild in the spring. And on every single one, he saw the telltale frost spine. The ghostly white line of ice along the peak of the roof was a stark advertisement of the heat pouring out from within. It was the signature of a losing battle. He made his notes, his gloved fingers stiff and clumsy. Then he came to the Vetlesen place. He stopped his horse. He stared. The bizarre whale-backed structure sat impassively in the frozen landscape. The low log walls were banked with earth, the single chimney puffing a lazy trail of smoke. But the roof was clean. There was no frost spine. The dark pitch timbers of the hull were bare and black against the gray sky. It was the only roof on the entire shore that wasn't openly broadcasting its failure. It was impossible. It defied everything he knew about building. Driven by a professional curiosity that outweighed the brutal cold, he dismounted and walked toward the cabin. He didn't intend to knock. He just wanted to see. He crept up to the single south-facing window, a small pane of precious glass that must have cost Vetlesen a fortune. He peered inside. What he saw stopped him cold. The scene was one of domestic tranquility. Vetlesen was carving a small wooden toy. His wife was reading a book. The children were asleep in a small bunk. But that wasn't what seized his attention. On the deep sill of the window, not 3 feet from where his own face was numb with cold, sat 2 beeswax candles. They were burning with tall, perfectly straight, unwavering flames. The flames were as still as if they were painted on glass. Quackenbush felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. He thought of the candle on his own table the night before, how its flame had danced and guttered, a frantic, desperate thing, whipped by the dozens of invisible drafts that crisscrossed his supposedly well-built shanty. He had always seen that flicker as a normal part of winter life. Now he understood. It was a signal of failure. The stillness of the Vetlesen's candle flames was the proof. It was the undeniable sensory evidence of a sealed envelope, of a home that had conquered the wind. He stepped back from the window, his mind reeling. The mockery of the autumn, his confident predictions of failure, all of it crumbled in the face of those 2 steady flames. He walked to the door and knocked. Sigurd opened it. No blast of cold air rushed out. No swirl of warm air billowed into the night. There was just a calm, even transition. Quackenbush stepped inside. He expected his senses to be assaulted by the shock of warmth, the way one feels when stepping from the cold into an overheated store. But the sensation was different. It was a gentle, enveloping warmth, as consistent at his feet as it was at his head. He pulled off a mitten, his bare hand tingling in the sudden peace. He looked up at the great curving timbers above. They were beautiful. He reached out and placed his palm against the inner planking of the hull. He expected it to be cold and damp, a surface bleeding heat to the outside. Instead, it was merely cool, dry, and solid as bedrock. It felt dense, ancient, and alive. He could feel the faint, stored warmth within the wood. In that moment, he understood. Sigurd hadn't just put a lid on a box. He had created something entirely different. Quackenbush turned to the quiet Norwegian, his face a mixture of awe and embarrassment. He looked around the small, warm, peaceful space. He looked at the calm, steady candle flames. He finally found his voice, not loud, but filled with a dawning reverence. "You didn't build a roof, Sigurd," Pernell Quackenbush said, his words becoming the legend. "You built a lower sky." The story of the lumber agent's conversion spread faster than the spring thaw. Quackenbush, the most credible and vocal skeptic, became the innovation's most fervent advocate. He didn't just admit he was wrong, he explained with the zeal of a convert precisely why he was wrong and why Sigurd was right. He spoke of the curved shell envelope, of the lack of a ridgepole, and of the two steady candle flames he had seen through the window. He described the even, draft-free warmth that filled the small cabin. Coming from him, a man whose business was selling lumber for conventional houses, the testimony was irrefutable. That spring, the proof of his advocacy appeared in the ledger of the Bayfield lumber yard. Next to sales of standard planks and shakes, a new entry appeared. In April of 1879, the yard manager logged the sale of a salvaged hull from the wreck of the Islander. In May, another from the Seafoam. By June, a third was sold. Men who had mocked Sigurd's upside-down boat in the fall were now hauling their own sections of shipwreck home, ready to build their own Vetlesen roofs. The idea spread through the arteries of the region's economy, the fishing crews. As the herring runs began, men from different camps worked side by side, sharing news and techniques. A fisherman from Sand Island would tell a crew from Oak Island about the Norwegian who stayed warm all winter under a boat. They spoke of the minimal wood he burned, the lack of drafts, the sheer comfort of the place. The story was passed along at net drying racks and in saloons, becoming a piece of local folklore rooted in hard practical fact. By the following winter, half a dozen of the strange, hump-backed cabins had appeared along the Apostle Island shoreline, each one a testament to an idea that had once been dismissed as madness. Sigurd Vetlesen never preached or promoted his design. He simply answered the questions of the men who came to his door, sharing what he knew freely and quietly, just as he had built. The quiet boat builder from Norway, with his ads and his deep understanding of how to shape wood against the elements, had stumbled upon a principle that modern building science would not formalize for another 70 years. His curved shell hull was a primitive but highly effective version of a monolithic dome or a stressed skin panel. His meticulous, pitch-sealed seams created the continuous air barrier that is now the holy grail of energy-efficient construction. He understood, intuitively, that preventing air infiltration was more important than adding thick insulation. His use of the dense oak hull as a thermal battery anticipated the modern concept of thermal mass, a strategy used in passive solar design to store heat and stabilize interior temperatures. Sigurd Vetlesen, using the wreckage of the past and the tools of an ancient trade, had built a house of the future. In the end, the story of Sigurd Vetlesen's roof is not about a clever trick with a salvaged hull. It is a story about the nature of knowledge itself. The frontiersmen on that shore possessed a deep and hard-won understanding of their environment, but their knowledge was locked in right angles and straight lines. Sigurd arrived with a different knowledge, a knowledge shaped by the sea, written in curves. He saw the hull not as a wreck, but as a solution. He saw a shape designed to hold a man above the killing cold of the water, and understood that the same shape could hold a family above the killing cold of the land. He turned a vessel that held him above the deep into a vessel that held warmth above his family. The mockery of his neighbors was the friction between two different worlds of wisdom. The vindication was not that one was right and the other wrong, but that in a place as unforgiving as a Lake Superior winter, survival belongs to the mind that is willing to turn the world upside down to find a better way to live. If you found this story of frontier ingenuity as fascinating as I did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more tales of practical genius. And let me know in the comments, what modern technology do you think was first discovered by accident or by someone working completely outside the field? Thank you for watching. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and building science. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.